The woman they pulled from Clapham Common had claw marks that went to the bone, 4 parallel gouges across her throat, precise as surgical incisions. The attending physician at St. Thomas's Hospital counted them twice, then asked the constable to fetch the detective inspector. Dr. Harrison had seen knife wounds, broken bottle cuts, fingernail scratches from desperate struggles. These were something else entirely, too wide for human fingers, too deep for any tool he could name, and the edges were cauterized, seared clean as if the claws themselves had been white-hot metal. The woman's name was Mary Ashford. 23 years old, seamstress, walking home from her sister's house in Battersea when something dropped from the sky onto the common. That's how she told it to Inspector Morrison when she finally stopped shaking enough to speak. Not stepped from the shadows, not emerged from the trees, dropped from above like a gargoyle falling from a cathedral spire. "It weren't human," she whispered, her voice raw from screaming. "Tall as 2 men it were, eyes like red coals. And when it opened its mouth," she touched her singed eyebrows, the skin beneath them blistered and weeping. "Blue fire, Inspector. It breathed blue fire right into me face." Morrison had heard stranger things in his 20 years with the Metropolitan Police. London's streets bred all manner of madness, and gaslight played tricks on even the steadiest minds. But Mary Ashford's wounds were real. Her burns were real. And she was the 7th victim in 3 months to describe the exact same impossible assailant. Spring-heeled Jack had returned to London. The newspapers called it mass hysteria. The penny dreadfuls called it divine judgment. The working folk of South London called it something far worse. They remembered the stories their grandparents told, the terror that had gripped the city 50 years earlier when a devil in gentleman's clothing had stalked the fog-shrouded streets, leaping over carriages and breathing hellfire at anyone unfortunate enough to cross his path. But that was 1837, ancient history. The original spring-heeled Jack should have been dead and buried decades ago, assuming he'd ever been flesh and blood to begin with. Yet here were the wounds. Here were the burns. Here was Mary Ashford's testimony, identical in every detail to accounts from half a century past. Inspector Morrison closed his notebook and walked to the hospital window. Gas lamps flickered to life along the Thames embankment as October dusk settled over the city. Somewhere out there in the maze of narrow streets and soot-stained tenements, something was hunting. Something that could leap impossible heights, spit fire like a dragon, and vanish into the night without leaving so much as a footprint on the cobblestones. He'd been a young constable during the last major outbreak of sightings in 1877, 12 years ago, but he remembered the panic that had swept through Peckham and Camberwell. Women afraid to leave their homes after dark, fathers walking their daughters to work with cricket bats and kitchen knives, extra patrols that found nothing but shadows and the lingering smell of sulfur. The attacks had stopped as suddenly as they'd begun, and London had moved on. New scandals, new fears. The city forgot about spring-heeled Jack the way it forgot about most things that didn't fit comfortably into the modern age of steam and steel. But forgetting and gone were 2 different things entirely. Morrison pulled out his watch. 6:30. The streets would be filling with workers heading home from the factories and shops, servant girls hurrying to finish their errands before full darkness fell. Perfect hunting time for whatever was using spring-heeled Jack's name and methods. He needed to visit the other victims, needed to map the pattern of attacks if there was one, needed to understand what he was truly hunting before more women ended up on Dr. Harrison's examination table with claw marks that went to the bone. The first victim had been Emma Prescott, a factory girl from Bermondsey, found 3 months earlier outside the Surrey docks, unconscious and severely burned around the face and hands. She'd told the same story, something that moved like liquid shadow, impossibly tall, with eyes that glowed like forge coals. It had cornered her in an alley between 2 warehouses, breathed fire until she fainted, then vanished by leaping straight up onto a warehouse roof 30 feet high. The second was Annie Walsh, a domestic servant from Rotherhithe. She'd been carrying laundry back to her employer's house when something dropped onto the street behind her. The creature had raked its claws across her back, tearing through her thick wool coat and the cotton dress beneath as if they were tissue paper. Like Mary Ashford, she described the impossible leap that had carried her attacker over the roof lines and out of sight. By the third attack, word was spreading through the working-class neighborhoods south of the Thames. Spring-heeled Jack was back. The devil had returned to London. Morrison took the omnibus to Bermondsey, then walked the narrow streets to Chambers Wharf, where Emma Prescott lived with her widowed mother in a single room above a cooperage. The smell of the Thames hung thick in the air, mixed with coal smoke and the perpetual stench of the nearby tanneries. This was old London, the London that existed in the gaps between the grand boulevards and municipal improvements, streets that hadn't changed much since the time of the first spring-heeled Jack sightings. Mrs. Prescott answered his knock with the wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust unexpected visitors, but she recognized Morrison from his previous visits and stepped aside to let him enter. "She's no better, Inspector," the older woman said. "Hardly leaves the room now. Won't walk alone, not even to the privy. The burns healed, but something else didn't." Emma sat by the single window, staring down at the narrow alley where she'd been attacked. Her face bore the shiny, tight scars of severe burning around the eyes and mouth. The wounds had healed cleanly, but they'd left her looking like a melted wax figure of her former self. "Miss Prescott," Morrison said gently, "I know this is difficult, but I need you to tell me again what you remember. Every detail. There have been more attacks." Emma turned from the window. Her eyes, once blue according to her mother, were now colorless as winter sky. The fire had damaged something behind them as well as the skin around them. "It knew me," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "That's what I didn't tell you before. It knew my name." Morrison felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What do you mean?" "When it first dropped down behind me, I thought it were just some man what had been drinking. Rough sort from the docks, maybe. I started to run, and it called out, 'Emma,' clear as daylight. 'Emma Prescott,' it said. 'Turn around and look at me, Emma Prescott.' She pressed her scarred fingers against the window glass. So I did. God help me, I turned around, and that's when I saw what it really was. Tall as a lamppost, wearing a great black cloak that moved like it were alive. But its face," Emma shuddered. "It had a face like a man, but wrong. Too sharp, too pale, and those eyes red as blood, looking right through me." "What did it say?" "It asked if I knew what I'd done, said I'd taken something that weren't mine to take, said it were time to pay the price." Emma's voice grew even quieter. "Then it opened its mouth and breathed fire at me, blue fire that burned like ice. I thought I were going to die, thought I were already in hell." Morrison made careful notes. This was new information, crucial information. The other victims had described a random attack, a creature that struck without warning or apparent motive. But Emma Prescott was claiming the thing had known her name, had accused her of something. "Miss Prescott, had you taken anything recently? From work, perhaps? Or found something that might have belonged to someone else?" Emma shook her head quickly, too quickly. "I never stole nothing, Inspector. I'm not a thief." But her mother was watching from across the room, and Morrison caught the worried glance the older woman cast toward a wooden box on the mantelpiece. He made a mental note to return when Emma wasn't present. The third victim, Annie Walsh, lived in a boarding house near the Surrey commercial docks. Morrison found her in the communal kitchen, peeling potatoes for the evening meal. The claw marks across her back had healed into 4 parallel ridges of scar tissue visible through her thin cotton blouse. She was more willing to talk than Emma had been, though her story was initially similar. Something had dropped from a warehouse roof, attacked her without warning, then vanished with a leap that carried it over the adjacent buildings. But when Morrison pressed for details, inconsistencies emerged. "Did it speak to you, Miss Walsh?" Annie paused in her peeling. "Speak? No, sir, it just laughed, horrible sound, like a hyena would have learned to sound like a man." "But you said in your original statement that it made no sound at all." "Did I?" Annie looked genuinely confused. "I don't rightly remember what I said before, Inspector. That night's all mixed up in me head. Sometimes I remember things one way, sometimes another." Morrison had seen this before in victims of violent crimes. The mind protected itself by blurring the details, making the unbearable uncertain. But Annie's confusion seemed deeper than normal trauma response. "What do you remember most clearly?" "The smell," Annie said without hesitation. "Sulfur and something else, something sweet and rotten, like Flowers left too long in water, and the cold. It were a warm night, but when that thing got close, the air turned cold as January. She set down her knife and rubbed her arms as if chilled by the memory. And its hands, Inspector. They weren't hands at all. More like a bird's claws, but made of metal. They rang like bells when they hit the brick wall beside me head. Left gouges in the stone. Morrison made a note to examine the alleged claw marks on the warehouse wall. Physical evidence would be invaluable if he could find it intact. Over the next 2 hours, he interviewed the remaining victims. Each told a similar story with disturbing variations. The creature was always impossibly tall, always wore a flowing black cloak, always had glowing red eyes and metallic claws. But the details shifted like fog. Sometimes it breathed blue fire, sometimes white. Sometimes it spoke. Sometimes it only laughed or remained silent. Sometimes it seemed to know its victims personally. Sometimes the attacks appeared random. The only constants were the wounds, 4 parallel claw marks, always the same width and depth, and the burns around the face and hands. Dr. Harrison had been right. These injuries were unlike anything in Morrison's experience. As darkness fell over South London, Morrison found himself standing in Spa Road, trying to understand the pattern. All the attacks had occurred within a roughly circular area bounded by the Thames to the north, the Old Kent Road to the south, and stretching from Bermondsey in the west to Rotherhithe in the east. Working-class neighborhoods, poorly lit with narrow streets and plenty of shadows. But why here? Why now? What had brought Spring-Heeled Jack back after more than a decade of silence? He was studying his map when a scream cut through the evening air. Morrison ran toward the sound, his boots echoing off the cobblestones. The scream came again, high and desperate, from somewhere near the railway arches that carried the Brighton line over a maze of narrow streets. Gas lamps were scarce in this part of Bermondsey, leaving deep pools of shadow between the scattered circles of yellow light. He found the victim in Miller's Yard, a narrow cul-de-sac lined with ramshackle tenements. A young woman, perhaps 20, lay crumpled against a brick wall. Her face was badly burned, the skin around her eyes and mouth already blistering. 4 parallel claw marks ran from her left temple to her jaw, but she was conscious, alert, and she was trying to tell him something. "Inspector," she gasped, recognizing his uniform. "It weren't what the others said." Morrison knelt beside her, pulling out his notebook. "What do you mean, miss?" "It weren't no devil, weren't no monster." Blood trickled from the corner of her mouth where the fire had burned her lips. It were a man in a devil's costume. Morrison felt his pulse quicken. "You saw his face?" "Saw through the costume. When he breathed fire, I saw the mechanism, like a magic lantern show, but smaller. Strapped to his chest, and the claws." She held up her hand, showing metal filings embedded in her palm. "They're real metal, but attached to gloves. I grabbed them when he struck me. Felt the leather underneath." "What else did you see?" "His boots." Her voice was growing weaker as shock set in. "Spring mechanisms in the heels, compressed steel coils. That's how he jumped so high. And the red eyes, colored glass with lamps behind them. Battery lamps." Morrison scribbled frantically. This was the breakthrough he'd been hoping for, a rational explanation that fit the evidence. "Did you see his face? His real face?" The woman nodded weakly. "Gentleman's face, clean-shaven, well-fed. This ain't no madman from the workhouse, Inspector. This is someone with money, someone what can afford all that equipment." "Why would a gentleman want to terrorize working people?" "Same reason they always do." The woman's eyes began to flutter closed. "Because they can. Because we can't fight back. Because it amuses them to watch us suffer." "Doctor." Harrison arrived within the hour. Summoned by a constable, Morrison had sent running to the hospital. As they loaded the latest victim into the ambulance, Morrison examined the scene more carefully by lamplight. Scorch marks on the brick wall where the fire had struck, 4 parallel gouges in the mortar where the claws had scraped, and most telling of all, a small brass fitting that had apparently fallen from the attacker's costume. Morrison pocketed it carefully, but as he prepared to leave Miller's Yard, something made him look up. There, silhouetted against the gaslit sky on the roof of the tenement building, stood a tall figure in a flowing cloak, too distant to make out details, but unmistakably watching him. As Morrison stared, the figure raised one arm in what might have been a greeting or a challenge. Then it leaped. Not jumped down into the yard or onto an adjacent roof. Leaped straight up into the air, impossibly high, disappearing into the darkness above the gas lamp's reach. Morrison ran to the spot where he'd seen the figure and looked up. Nothing but empty sky and the distant glow of London's lights reflecting off the low-hanging clouds. But the smell lingered. Sulfur and something else. Something sweet and rotten, like flowers left too long in water. He examined the brass fitting more closely under a gas lamp. It was clearly manufactured, machine-made with precise tolerances. But the metal was warm to the touch, warmer than it should have been after lying on cold cobblestones. And etched into its surface was a symbol he didn't recognize. A stylized flame surrounded by what looked like a coiled spring. Morrison pocketed the evidence and made his way back toward the main road, his mind racing. The latest victim's testimony suggested a human perpetrator using mechanical devices to simulate supernatural abilities. But what he'd just witnessed on the rooftop challenged that rational explanation. No spring mechanism, however sophisticated, could launch a man straight up into the air that high. Unless there was more than one of them. Unless Spring-Heeled Jack wasn't a single individual, but a group, a conspiracy of wealthy thrill-seekers amusing themselves by terrorizing the poor. Or unless something else was happening in the shadows of Victorian London, something that defied rational explanation, no matter how much evidence suggested otherwise. The fog was rolling in from the Thames as Morrison caught the last omnibus back to Scotland Yard. Through the windows, he watched the familiar landmarks of London blur into indistinct shapes. Gas lamps became distant stars. The solid architecture of the modern world dissolved into something far more mysterious and threatening. Somewhere in that maze of fog and shadow, Spring-Heeled Jack was planning his next attack. Whether man or devil, rational or supernatural, one thing was certain: the terror that had gripped London 50 years earlier was back. And this time, Morrison was determined to discover the truth behind the legend, even if that truth proved more disturbing than the mystery itself. Back at Scotland Yard, Morrison spread his evidence across his desk under the flickering gaslight. The brass fitting, still unnaturally warm. His notes from the victim interviews. A map of South London marked with red ink at each attack site. The pattern was there, waiting to be decoded. He'd sent word to the forensics department about the metal filings the latest victim had scraped from her attacker's claws. Modern police work demanded modern methods, even when investigating something as archaic as Spring-Heeled Jack. But as Morrison studied the evidence, rational explanations felt increasingly inadequate. The brass fitting bore no maker's marks, no identifying stamps. The metal itself was unlike anything he'd seen. Too light to be brass, too durable to be tin. When he scratched it with his penknife, sparks flew. When he held it near the gas flame, it grew hot enough to burn his fingers. A knock at his office door interrupted his examination. Constable Williams entered, looking pale and shaken. "Inspector, there's been another incident, but this one's different." Morrison looked up from his notes. "Different how?" "The victim's still alive, sir, and she's asking for you specifically." The hansom cab carried them through fog-shrouded streets to Guy's Hospital. Morrison found Dr. Harrison waiting in the corridor outside the women's ward, his face grim. "This one's not like the others, Inspector. The burns are superficial, the claw marks shallow. But there's something else, something I can't explain in medical terms." "What do you mean?" "Doctor." Harrison led him to a private room where a young woman sat upright in bed, her face bearing minor burns but her eyes sharp and alert. She was perhaps 25, well-dressed despite the attack, with the bearing of someone accustomed to giving orders rather than taking them. "Inspector Morrison? I'm Charlotte Pembroke. We need to talk." Morrison pulled up a chair. "Miss Pembroke, can you tell me what happened?" "I was attacked by Spring-Heeled Jack, but not randomly." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I went looking for him, and I found him." "You went looking for him? Why?" Charlotte Pembroke's story unfolded like pages from a penny dreadful, but told with the precision of someone accustomed to being believed. She revealed, the daughter of Sir Edmund Pembroke, a wealthy industrialist with interests in mining and metallurgy. More importantly, she was an amateur investigator of what she termed unusual phenomena. The attacks aren't random, Inspector. They're connected to something that happened 50 years ago during the original Spring-Heeled Jack incidents. My father was involved. He was young then, part of a group of gentlemen who made a terrible mistake. Morrison made notes, though part of him wondered if he was documenting the ravings of someone traumatized by a brutal attack. But Charlotte's voice remained steady, her details precise. In 1837, there was indeed a creature terrorizing London, something not quite human. A group of wealthy young men, my father among them, decided to hunt it. They were convinced it was some sort of exotic animal that had escaped from a private menagerie. They built equipment, weapons, mechanical devices designed to capture something that could leap impossible heights and breathe fire. And did they find it? Charlotte nodded. They cornered it in the old plague tunnels beneath Southwark, ancient passages that honeycombed the ground beneath South London. What they found there. Inspector, my father never spoke of it directly, but he spent the rest of his life trying to atone for what they did. She pulled a leather portfolio from beneath her hospital bedding. These are his journals, his records of everything that happened in 1837, and everything he believed would happen again. Morrison opened the portfolio carefully. The pages were filled with detailed sketches, chemical formulas, and precise engineering drawings. Diagrams of spring-loaded boots capable of launching a man 20 feet into the air, designs for a fire-breathing apparatus using phosphorus and compressed gases, detailed anatomical studies of something that was definitely not human. But one sketch made Morrison's blood run cold. It showed a creature that matched every victim's description perfectly. Impossibly tall, with metallic claws and glowing eyes. But beneath the drawing, written in a shaking hand, were the words, "What we created. God forgive us." Created? Morrison looked up at Charlotte. You're saying Spring-Heeled Jack is artificial, some sort of machine? Not machine, not exactly. Charlotte's voice carried a weight of old horror. My father and his friends found something in those tunnels, something that had been sleeping beneath London for centuries, something old and hungry and not quite dead. She turned to another page, showing chemical formulas and metallurgical processes Morrison couldn't begin to understand. They thought they could control it, bind it, use modern science to harness whatever unnatural forces animated it. They built the costume, the mechanical enhancements, thinking they could contain its power within controllable limits. And instead, they created something worse, a fusion of ancient malevolence and modern ingenuity. The original entity's hunger and intelligence, but equipped with the tools of the industrial age. It escaped their control within months, and every few decades, when the binding weakens, it returns to feed. Morrison studied the drawings, trying to reconcile what he saw with everything he thought he knew about the world. Feed on what? Terror, pain, the life force of its victims. It doesn't kill them because dead people can't suffer. It marks them, burns them, traumatizes them so deeply that they carry its influence for the rest of their lives. Every nightmare they have, every moment of remembered fear, feeds it from a distance. The pieces began falling into place. The pattern of attacks, the victim's lasting trauma, the way the creature seemed to know personal details about those it targeted. But why you? Why did you go looking for it? Charlotte's composure finally cracked. Because I think I know how to stop it. My father spent 50 years researching ways to undo what he'd done. Before he died last month, he gave me this. She produced a small brass device from her portfolio. It was similar to the fitting Morrison had found in Miller's yard, but complete, intricate, covered in symbols and tiny mechanisms. A binding key, designed to sever the connection between the entity and its mechanical enhancements. If someone could get close enough to use it. Miss Pembroke, you're talking about confronting something that's terrorized London for half a century. Yes, her voice was steady again, and I'm talking about doing it tonight. Morrison stood up, pacing to the window. Outside, fog pressed against the glass like grasping fingers. Somewhere in that maze of shadow and gaslight, Spring-Heeled Jack was hunting. Rational thought warred with the evidence of his own eyes. Assuming I believe any of this, how do you propose to find something that can vanish at will? Charlotte smiled, though there was no humor in it. It found me once already, didn't it? And it let me live, which suggests it wants something from me. Probably this. She held up the brass device. You're proposing to use yourself as bait. I'm proposing to finish what my father started, to undo a wrong that's caused suffering for 50 years. Morrison looked at the evidence spread across the hospital bed. The drawings, the chemical formulas, the mechanical devices. Everything his rational mind rejected, yet everything his eyes had witnessed suggested might be true. Miss Pembroke, even if everything you've told me is accurate, this is police business now. You can't simply... A scream from somewhere in the hospital cut off his objection. Then another. Then the sound of running feet in the corridor outside. Dr. Harrison burst through the door, his face white with terror. Inspector, it's here, in the hospital. It's come for her. The lights went out. Emergency lanterns flickered to life as staff ran through the corridors. Morrison drew his service revolver, though he had little faith in conventional weapons against what they faced. Charlotte gripped the brass binding key, her knuckles white in the dim light. The smell reached them first, sulfur and decay, growing stronger by the moment. Then the sound, not footsteps, but something like metal scraping against stone, growing closer. The plague tunnels, Charlotte whispered. They run beneath this part of London too. It can travel underground, emerge anywhere. A crash from the floor below shook the entire building, then screaming. Not the sharp cry of sudden shock, but the prolonged agony of someone being systematically terrorized. Morrison made his decision. Dr. Harrison, evacuate this floor. Get everyone out. Miss Pembroke, if you're right about that device, now might be our only chance to use it. They made their way toward the main staircase, following the sounds of chaos from below. Gas lamps exploded as they passed, filling the air with the stench of burning fuel. Windows cracked without being touched, as if the very presence of spring-heeled Jack warped reality around it. On the first floor, Morrison saw it clearly for the first time. The creature stood in the center of the main ward, surrounded by overturned beds and terrified patients. It was exactly as the victims had described, yet worse than any description could convey. Impossibly tall, draped in a cloak that moved independent of any wind, with eyes like red coals, set in a face that was almost human, but fundamentally wrong. But Charlotte had been right about the artificial elements. Morrison could see the mechanical apparatus integrated into its form, steam pipes running through the cloak, gear mechanisms in the joints of its limbs, the spring-loaded boots that allowed its impossible leaps, and strapped to its chest, a complex device that glowed with internal fire. It turned toward them as they entered the ward, and Morrison felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of the world. This was not just a creature, not just a machine. It was something that existed in the spaces between categories, defying every assumption about what was possible. When it spoke, its voice carried harmonics that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Charlotte Pembroke, you carry your father's guilt, and his key. I carry his responsibility, Charlotte replied, stepping forward despite Morrison's attempt to hold her back. And I'm here to finish what he started. The creature tilted its head, a gesture almost human in its curiosity. Your father was wise in his final years. He understood that some doors, once opened, cannot be closed, only transferred. What do you mean? The binding requires a willing vessel, someone to contain what your father released. He intended to sacrifice himself, but death claimed him first. The red eyes fixed on Charlotte with terrible intensity. So the burden falls to you, Morrison raised his revolver. Miss Pembroke, step away from that thing. But Charlotte had already understood. The binding key doesn't destroy you. It traps you inside someone else, someone who has to carry you for the rest of their life. As your father carried me for 50 years, the creature confirmed, fighting my influence, limiting my hungers, using his will to contain what his folly created. But he is gone now, and I am free to feed as I choose. Unless someone else takes his place. Unless someone else takes his place. Morrison watched in growing horror as Charlotte raised the brass device. Miss Pembroke, you can't possibly be considering... How many more will it kill if I don't? Charlotte's voice was steady, resolved. How many more Emma Prescotts? How many more lives destroyed by something my family helped create? The creature waited, motionless except for the mechanical breathing apparatus on its chest. Patient, almost gentle. "The choice is yours, Charlotte Pembroke, but choose quickly. I grow hungry, and there are many innocents in this building." Charlotte looked at Morrison, and he saw her father's guilt in her eyes, the weight of generations of suffering caused by a single act of arrogant curiosity. "Inspector, when this is over, tell them the truth, all of it. Don't let it become another legend, another penny dreadful story. The people of London deserve to know what really happened." She pressed the brass key against her chest, directly over her heart. The effect was immediate and terrible. Light erupted from the device, not the warm yellow of gas lamps, but something cold and blue-white that hurt to look at directly. The creature's form began to waver, becoming translucent, as whatever unholy energy animated it was drawn into the key. Charlotte screamed, but she held on. The mechanical apparatus fell away piece by piece as the entity was torn from its artificial housing. Steam pipes clattered to the floor. The spring-loaded boots collapsed into twisted metal. The fire-breathing device sparked once and went dark. But as the creature's physical form dissolved, Morrison saw something far worse take its place. A shadow that moved independent of any light source. A presence that pressed against his mind like oil against glass. Something ancient and hungry and utterly alien to human understanding. And all of it flowing into Charlotte Pembroke through the brass key pressed against her heart. When the light faded, she was still standing, but her eyes now carried flecks of red in their depths. And when she smiled, Morrison glimpsed something that was not entirely Charlotte looking out. "It's done," she said. Her voice was her own, but underneath it, something else whispered in harmonics only dogs could hear. "The binding holds, for now." Morrison approached carefully, his revolver still drawn, though he knew it was useless. "Miss Pembroke, are you yourself?" "Mostly." Charlotte touched the brass key, now dim and cool against her chest. "But I can feel it, the hunger, the ancient rage. My father was strong enough to contain it for 50 years. I pray I inherited his will, along with his guilt." She walked to one of the ward windows and looked out over fog-shrouded London. "It will try to break free, of course. Especially when I sleep, it will send dreams, whisper suggestions, show me all the ways I could let it loose to feed. And if you weaken? If the binding fails?" Charlotte's smile was sad but determined. "Then Spring-Heeled Jack returns to London. But until that day, Inspector, the people of this city can sleep peacefully. The devil has a new guardian, and she understands the cost of failure." Morrison spent the next hour documenting everything he'd witnessed, though he knew no official report would ever reflect the true nature of what had occurred. Some truths were too large for bureaucratic forms, too strange for courtroom testimony. As dawn broke over London, dissolving the fog that had shrouded the city's darkest corners, Morrison made his final notes. 7 victims, all recovering from their injuries. 1 perpetrator, contained if not destroyed. Case closed by any official measure. But Charlotte Pembroke's journals would become his private obsession for the remaining 30 years of his career. Her father's research, her own sacrifice, the terrible mathematics of binding ancient evil within human flesh. He visited her quarterly, documenting the slow changes as the entity tested its prison. She aged rapidly, gray threading her hair before her 30th birthday. Her eyes grew deeper, as if she were constantly looking at something just beyond normal sight. But her will held. The binding held. And Spring-Heeled Jack vanished from London streets as completely as if he had never existed. Morrison retired in 1919, 30 years after that night in Guy's Hospital. Charlotte Pembroke died peacefully in her sleep 3 days later, as if she'd been waiting for his watch to end. They found her with the brass key still pressed against her heart, now nothing more than a curiosity in a curio shop window. I was Morrison's grandson. He told me this story on his deathbed in 1923, pressing Charlotte's journals into my hands along with a warning I've never forgotten. "The binding was never permanent," he whispered as life left his eyes, "only transferred, and Charlotte had no children to carry the burden after her. I've spent 70 years since then waiting, watching, following reports of strange attacks in the poorer quarters of London. Each time hoping I'm wrong, each time preparing for the possibility that Spring-Heeled Jack has found a way to break free once more. But perhaps some stories are best left as legends. Perhaps some truths are too dangerous for telling. Still, on foggy nights when the gas lamps flicker and shadows move independent of their sources, I remember Morrison's warning. And I keep the brass keys twin, the one Charlotte's father made as a backup, locked in my safe upstairs. Just in case London ever needs another guardian, just in case the devil comes hunting again.